I personally generally do reserve lenalidomide for patients whose disease has progressed. So I will often use it now in the second line setting. The data supporting that choice comes from two clinical trials. The first is called the AUGMENT trial, in which patients were randomly assigned between the combination of lenalidomide and rituximab versus rituximab alone. And that study showed almost a tripling of the median progression-free survival and improvement in response rate with the combination of len plus rituximab versus rituximab alone with an acceptable toxicity profile. So that augment trial was critical in our understanding of the value of the R squared or lenalidomide rituximab combination. The other trial that has informed my practice is called MAGNIFY, and this was a trial similarly, all patients received lenalidomide and rituximab in the relapse setting. The trial has demonstrated an overall response rate in the 70% plus range, complete response rate in the 40s. The trial is a little more complicated in that patients are randomized after 1 year of therapy to two different maintenance arms, and we don't know the results of the maintenance component of that trial yet. But certainly we have several hundred patients treated on MAGNIFY with good outcomes, very similar to those seen in the AUGMENT trial and other earlier studies. And so I think based on those two trials, I feel very comfortable offering the combo of lenalidomide and rituximab to my patients with relapsed disease. That can be either second line, it can be third line, it can be fourth line, it can really be any time. There is a trial that I mentioned earlier, called RELEVANCE, that compared lenalidomide rituximab with chemoimmunotherapy in the frontline setting. I discussed that earlier in our discussion here, and it showed good results. I mean, the median progression-free survival in the two arms was the same, and so we know that it's an effective treatment in the frontline setting. It just doesn't have quite the long-term follow-up. It doesn't have an FDA label, and there's a different toxicity profile. So it can be considered for frontline patients, but I would say I would choose it in only the minority for my patients. The GALEN trial was a phase 2 trial conducted in France that combined lenalidomide with obinutuzumab. So a lot of our data up until now with lenalidomide has used rituximab. As I said, in AUGMENT, that's what was used. In MAGNIFY, that was used. In RELEVANCE, that's what was used. And in other earlier studies, rituximab was the partner for lenalidomide. So GALEN trial built on some earlier studies and did a larger phase 2 study of the combo of obinutuzumab with lenalidomide, and demonstrated a good response rate on the order of 80% overall response rate, and complete response rate also in the 40s. One of the interesting features of GALEN is that the POD24 patients did seem to fare a little better than those patients in the MAGNIFY trial. And so the authors of the GALEN trial pointed that out, that maybe the obinutuzumab antibody partner might be a little more effective than the rituximab antibody partner. I think that's really an unknown at this point. These are different trials, different patient populations. The POD24 group was small in the GALEN trial. I mean, the total trial, I think, was about 79 patients, and I think the POD24s were only about 20% of those. So pretty small numbers on which to be basing major conclusions. And so personally, I don't know whether obinutuzumab, when combined with lenalidomide, is better than rituximab when combined with lenalidomide. I'm not sure we'll ever have a definite answer to that question. I think it's very reasonable for, say, a patient who's received a fair amount of rituximab in the past and is now going to go on to a lenalidomide-based regimen to combine it with obinutuzumab. That is now on NCCN guidelines, but it is not a labeled indication for obinutuzumab by the FDA. So it's reasonable, seems to be safe, has good activity, and that's where it's at. I think probably in my practice, I'll choose rituximab more commonly to go with lenalidomide. And it's also true in my practice that I'll choose obinutuzumab earlier in the course than many docs. So I'm using, as I said, obinutuzumab in the frontline setting. So probably for my relapse patients, I'm still going to be using lenalidomide, rituximab. So one can use both antibodies in the course of the patient's disease and their treatment.